You were never supposed to make it this far. That was their plan. They didn't just take your innocence, they tried to rewrite your identity. By stealing your childhood, they believed they could hijack your destiny. If they could fracture your foundation early enough, maybe you'd never find your power. But they underestimated the resilience of a soul that was never meant to stay broken. Here's the truth they never wanted you to realize. You were the entire production. The light, the gravity, the blueprint. They mistook you for a background character in your own story, thinking their control would last forever. But the real plot twist came the moment you stopped trying to prove yourself and walked away. Psychology proves it. People value what's scarce. And when you stopped explaining, stopped returning, stopped playing their game, the panic set in. They're not over you. They're haunted by you, mentally replaying every moment, every choice, every chance they had to do right by you. And now, you're no longer accessible, no longer bending, no longer breakable. Outgrowing the version of yourself that once needed their approval is the ultimate power move, because they tried to kill your future by stealing your past. But you became someone they'll never be able to reach again. First of all, they are now only background noise. Yet they were your battleground. They believed that you would always be there, engaged in a never-ending struggle for their affection, their attention, and their approval. Every debate, tacit treatment, and mental exercise was intended to keep you interested, proving, chasing, and battling. They need it because it gave them comfort, not because they cared. They had power as long as you were responding. They were still relevant as long as you were still fighting. Then, however, something changed. One day, you awoke to the realization that this was not a conflict worth waging. You weren't fighting a battle. Rather, you were caught in a vicious cycle that was meant to keep you worn out, emotionally spent, and continuously doubting your own value. For what purpose? To prove yourself to someone who would never appreciate you unless it was advantageous to them. You took the unimaginable action and left. No last words to help them comprehend. No dramatic departure. No last argument. You just ceased to appear on the battlefield. They sensed it then. The quiet, the emptiness, the total lack of response. See, they thought you would plead, defend, and hold out hope that they might change at last. But you didn't. The fact that they are no longer the center of your world, not even in the orbit, is what most unnerved them. You've channeled the energy they formerly took from you into your own development and tranquility. They now realize they were only one chapter in a larger tale, even if they had believed they were irreplaceable. What's the best part? The remainder of the tale is kept a secret from them. They were expelled from the theater, leaving them to wonder what would happen next, even though they believed they had a front-row ticket to your struggle. And they didn't anticipate that emotion. Number 2, you were the first to notice the expiration date. They believed they had time. They thought you would be there all the time, hoping, waiting a little while longer. They pushed limits, played their games, and tried your patience, always believing that you would never truly walk away from them, no matter how near you came to the brink. They were unaware, however, that you had already witnessed the end a long time before they did. You observed the gradual deterioration and the surface fissures. You were able to identify the trends, the pretexts, and the cliched, meaningless explanations. You were quietly separating 1 minute at a time, while they were preoccupied with presuming they were in charge. Individuals like that never believe their opportunities would end. They think their inconsistencies will always be forgiven, and that their very existence is sufficient to keep you bound. They mistake perpetual access for your patience. They don't realize, however, that there isn't a big statement when someone is genuinely exhausted, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. It's a silent change with no warning shot, and it's already too late when they discover that you've changed. Thus, you had already checked out while they were still engaged in their little power struggles. Before they even realized the strain, you felt the link they took for granted dissolve. They never cared to look closely enough to see it coming, which is why your departure seemed so abrupt to them. It never occurred to them that the well might truly run empty. They are currently fumbling, perplexed, and attempting to pinpoint the precise moment that everything changed. The problem is that it didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual disintegration, a silent epiphany, and a firm awareness that continuing to stay would only cause you to lose more of who you are. You had already made up your mind long before you left, so it wasn't an emotional response when you did. And nothing has greater power than someone who departs because they just don't belong there, not because they're angry or trying to prove anything. Number 3, indifference is power, not silence. They believed that your lack of reaction was a premeditated tactic to attract their attention, make them miss you, and make them want to follow you. They awaited the text that never arrived, the response that never materialized, and the instant that you would break and go back to the routine that they were so accustomed to. However, they were unaware that it was more than simply stillness. Rather, it was something far more profound and unexpected. Apathy, anger, pain, or the desire that someone would notice and take action can all be expressed via silence. But apathy, that's what all of it is missing. That's when you stop looking at their social media accounts, stop speculating about their feelings, and stop mentally reliving discussions. It's when their name is spoken and you feel nothing at all, rather than a wave of feelings. They didn't anticipate that. They believed they had more time to manipulate your feelings, to fade away and resurface when it was convenient for them, to neglect you long enough to make you want for their attention once again. But your cravings ceased. You gave up waiting. You completely stopped responding. Then the balance of power changed. They may act as though it doesn't affect them, but they are aware of it in their hearts. They sense the void where your vitality once was, the area you once occupied with your work, your concern, and your presence. And they are aware of it, despite their best efforts to deny it. They are aware that they lost something tangible. Removing their power to influence you, to exist outside of their grasp, to wake up one day and not be pulled by their pandemonium is the worst thing you can do to someone who thrives on control. That is what true freedom looks like. A separation so profound that their presence no longer matters in your life. Not a quiet that yet harbors a secret hope. And they will never be able to reverse that. Fourth, they thought their presence was valuable. They believed that their very existence made them irreplaceable, that their minimal effort was sufficient to maintain your interest, and that they were significant just because they took up space in your life. Convinced that you were fortunate to have them, they walked about your world with a sense of entitlement, never questioning if they truly contributed anything worthwhile. However, value is not the same as presence. One can just stand in a room and do nothing. They can only cause confusion, tension, and emotional weariness in your life. And they did precisely that. Their presence was mistaken for significance. They thought they were important because they had access to you. However, they were only recognizable. You allowed familiarity to deceive you into thinking they were required for far too long. You allowed history to take precedence over joy. Because they had been in your life for so long that it seemed strange to think of them leaving, you kept them around, rather than because they actually made you happy. Then it dawned on you that they weren't a present. There was no award for them. All they were was cozy pandemonium. Furthermore, all they really did was create the false impression that their mere presence was important. Walking away felt so different than you had anticipated because of this. Nothing was lost by you. Nothing was missed by you. Without them, life became lighter rather than tougher. You realized then that they were only ever stealing from your life, never giving to it. The irony? The only thing you lost was the burden of their delusion, even though they expected you to mourn their departure. At that point, you ceased considering their presence to be a blessing, which it never was. Number 5. Getting closure is a decision, not a discussion. Closure is not a box that is checked off once a few words are said, nor is it something that is worked out over one last chat. When you decide that you're finished, that the chapter is over, and that you're not allowing anyone else to continue rewriting your tale, that's a choice you make for yourself, in the hopes that one more conversation will somehow make things right or tie up all the loose ends. They could anticipate a big conclusion or a definitive explanation. However, you are more knowledgeable. You realize that finding closure is about taking back your own peace and determining that their opinion is no longer required, not about giving them one final chance to make a plea or to organize their story. You've already drawn the line in your mind. You understand that every word spoken in a farewell talk has the potential to prolong the inevitable or rekindle old scars. Rather, you chose a silent determination, a strong choice that stated, "I'm done." That decision was about halting the emotional back and forth that had only ever left you feeling more exhausted, not about leaving them with a sense of unresolved business. You took charge by deciding to have closure rather than have a discussion. You resisted allowing the story of another person to control your recovery. It was a straightforward, silent gesture of self-respect, rather than a theatrical departure or a contentious farewell speech. You made the decision at that same time that the chapter was ended, that no further explanation was necessary, and that you were not responsible for their obligation to continue involving you. They may have anticipated a final effort to make things right, but you realized that sometimes the best course of action is to completely cease interacting. In actuality, closure is a gift you offer to yourself rather than someone else. Additionally, you gained the power to create your next chapter on your own terms by ending that one without their consent. Number 6. You no longer confused desire with chaos. You believed for a long time that the highs and lows, the late-night disputes and heartfelt apologies, the jealousy, the unpredictable nature, the dramatic departures, and even more dramatic returns were evidence of genuine, passionate love. Since the turmoil was all you had ever known, you mistakenly believed it to be something significant. However, you soon realized that it was not love, but rather emotional manipulation. The roller coaster was a cycle of control rather than evidence of enthusiasm. Only because the lows had been rendered intolerable did the highs seem so wonderful. Only because the damage had been so great did the apologies seem credible. After creating the storm, they persuaded you that it meant something to you to survive it together. However, love is not meant to be a means of survival. Love shouldn't leave you feeling worn out, self-conscious, or always on the lookout for the next emotional upheaval. Suffering is not necessary for love to feel valuable. You realized at last that quiet was healthy, not dull. Stability was a basis, not a lack of enthusiasm. Furthermore, the lack of turmoil marked the start of true love, rather than its absence. You left because you had finally begun to think, not because you had ceased feeling. You saw how they kept you captivated with just enough warmth to make you forget about the cold, as well as how they manipulated you. And you made a different decision. You chose serenity over chaos, genuine connection over dysfunctional addiction. What about the irony? You no longer want to live without the exact things you previously feared: peace, stability, and predictability. You used to believe that turmoil equated to love, but now you realize that love shouldn't seem like a lost war. Number 7. Their largest mirror is now your absence. They were always more interested in a diversion, a shield, or a mirror that only reflected the version of themselves they desired than they were in true love. You performed that role for a long time without ever recognizing it. You provided them with attention when they felt invisible, comfort when they couldn't bear to be left alone with their own thoughts, and affirmation when they felt little. You turned into their emotional support system, preventing them from confronting the void within. But you went away after that. All of a sudden, they had nothing to conceal themselves from, no one to stroke their pride, ease their fears, or fill the gap they had never been willing to admit existed. They were alone with themselves for the first time, but it was the version of themselves they had spent so much time avoiding, not the one they wanted the world to see. At that point, the true terror began. They wanted you to pursue them because it would demonstrate that they were still important, powerful, and less readily replaced than they privately feared. However, you didn't. You left in a state of indifference rather than rage or resentment. And that was the one thing for which they were unprepared. Because now, all they have left is the reality, without your presence to reflect back a reassuring fiction. In actuality, they were never as powerful as they made themselves out to be. They were never as cohesive as they appeared to be. They start to wonder if they ever had any worth in the first place, if you don't remind them of it all the time. You no longer have to bear that load. For them, your absence is a confrontation with their own reality rather than only a loss. And they sense it despite their best efforts to deny it. Number 8. You came to see that sticking with dysfunction is a betrayal of yourself. You wore your allegiance like a badge of pride for a very long time. Even when they weren't fighting for you, you stayed. You showed forgiveness, and you stood up for them. You persuaded yourself that love required sacrifice, commitment meant perseverance, and leaving meant failure. But then the terrible reality struck. Continuing to live in disorder was self-betrayal, not loyalty. Loyalty is for things that make you proud, not for things that make you feel bad. However, dysfunction deceives you. It gives you the impression that enduring the turmoil is a sign of strength, and that surviving the suffering is evidence of love. You assured yourself that you were being understanding, patient, and loyal. In actuality, though, you were deserting yourself. You weren't being strong. Rather, you were gradually deleting yourself each time you justified their actions, put up with the falsehoods, the disrespect, and the mental games. And you were awakened by that. You came to see that the love you were freely giving them was the same love you had been withholding from yourself, that remaining was not honorable, but harmful, and that waiting for them to change while they still drained you was not an act of faith, but rather self-neglect. You picked yourself, which was the toughest and most important choice you had to make. You began to care more about yourself, not because you stopped caring. You realized that genuine loyalty begins with self-respect, which occasionally entails separating from others who don't treat you with the respect and effort you merit. What about the irony? You became everything they never imagined you would be. Untouchable, unreachable, and totally free. The instant you stopped violating yourself for them. Number 9. You're conserving your energy, not demonstrating a point. They believed that your desire to leave them was a ploy to make them miss you, to make them want to find you, to make them see how valuable you were. They believed you were engaged in the same game of manipulation, control, and measured distance that they had perfected. However, they were mistaken. This was about you, not about them at all. It wasn't a chessboard move to walk away. It had nothing to do with demanding a response or demonstrating a point. It was a matter of survival. It was about recognizing how much you were being drained by the scenario and coming to the conclusion that you would completely lose yourself if you stayed. You were attempting to rescue your own soul, not to impart knowledge to them. Individuals who thrive on disorder are unaware of that. For them, every move is a game, every stillness is a ruse, and every departure is a temporary one. They never think about the possibility that you left them to protect yourself rather than to punish them, that your emotional stability, mental clarity, and tranquility were more important than their desire for dominance. The true difference is that you went away for freedom, whereas they do things to get a reaction. The pandemonium inside was no longer worth your energy, so you just closed the door without making a disturbance with a smash. No grandiose farewells, no parting remarks to help them comprehend. Just a silent, firm resolve to stop taking part in your own misery. They were anticipating the performance, the back and forth, and the eventual return, which is why it makes them so uneasy. Instead, you provided them with nothing but distance, no resentment, no justifications, and no residual affection. And you discovered the tranquility they would never grant you in that distance. 10. There are some who adore you only when you are under them. Some folks like controlling you more than they love you. They were at ease when you were continually seeking their approval, doubting your value, and doubting yourself. They felt safest and most in control at that moment. They had the upper hand, as long as you were under them, whether that be financially, emotionally, or intellectually. However, everything changed the instant you began to rise, develop, and get a clear understanding of yourself. As long as your love for them was accompanied by insecurity, as long as it caused you to settle, shrink, and become reliant on their approval, they didn't mind. They lost their hold the moment you began to love yourself more than you enjoyed proving yourself to them. That's when the change occurred. All of a sudden, people started to dislike the things you had previously been commended for. Your self-assurance turned into arrogance. It was never about love. It was about positioning. Your development became, "You've changed." Your self-respect became, "You think you're too good now." Since their strength derived from having you beneath them, they required you. Your independence, the fact that you no longer need their approval to feel worthwhile, and the fact that you stopped pursuing their affirmation like air, were the things that frightened them, not your love. They left you when you leveled up because they didn't know how to love you equally, not because you did anything wrong. Only when you were doubting yourself, proving yourself, and trying hard to earn what ought to have been given to you freely, did they know how to love you. But that's control, not love. Now that you are in control, you can clearly notice the difference. You're no longer looking back, since true love never existed if it only existed while you were beneath someone. Number 11. You no longer bargained for your value. You formerly let other people to determine your value. In an attempt to convince them that you were good enough, Deserving enough and loving enough, you went above and beyond to prove yourself. You put up with disrespect, inconsistency, and a bare minimum of effort because you believed that if you worked more and loved them more, they would eventually realize how valuable you were. Then you awoke, nevertheless, and the most potent thing that ever occurred to you was that awakening. You came to the realization that your value could never be compromised. It wasn't anything to be negotiated, a contract, or a dispute. The degree to which someone recognized it, valued it, or even acknowledged it didn't determine it. It just was. And everything changed when you realized that. You ceased debating with those who attempted to minimize you. You ceased demonstrating your worth to those who only appreciated you when it suited them. You ceased pleading for respect, affection, or attention as though it were a luxury rather than a necessity. People that valued you but yet required you to earn it left you. And the dynamic changed as soon as you done it. People who live on control and self-doubt detest it when you quit playing their game, when you don't fight for what's necessary, and when you stop reacting to their games, their silence, and their emotional withholding. They relied on your lack of confidence, your need for validation, and your readiness to compromise your value in order to retain them. However, you no longer do that. You don't pursue. You're not begging. You don't give an explanation. You know that the appropriate people would never force you to show your worth, so you live in it. And the incorrect ones? The instant you decided you were no longer debatable, they lost access to you. Number 12. Their love was your burden. Your love was their ego boost. Some individuals desire worship instead of affection. What they want is confirmation, not relationship. And they took that very thing away from you. Your every bit of love, effort, and dedication was something they thrived off of, not something they treasured. They were infatuated with the extent of your love for them, not with you. Now you can see it plainly. It wasn't returned. Instead, it was absorbed, stolen, and used as fuel to boost their ego and persuade them that they were important, desired, and worthwhile. This included every kind word you spoke, every forgiveness you offered, and every effort you made to show your loyalty. What did you receive in exchange? Bewilderment, emotional strain, and the burden of constantly giving when they only got. Because their love wasn't love at all, if that's what you can call it. It was conditional, performative, and selective. It came in the form of breadcrumbs, just enough warmth to prevent you from leaving, and just enough attention to keep you interested. However, it turned into a burden, an issue, and something they weren't prepared to provide the instant you wanted that same love back, the minute you asked for constancy, care, and emotional safety. So you went. You stopped starving yourself to stroke their ego, not to teach them a lesson or make them miss you. And that's when they really started to worry. Because their ego is now famished without your affection, your certainty, and your unwavering presence that reminds them of their value. They must confront the reality that they have always evaded. They were never sufficient for themselves. That's why they were so in need of you. However, you are no longer burdened by it. You left with your love unbroken, prepared to offer it to someone who will not only accept it, but also give it back completely. And them? The emptiness that existed long before you arrived is the only thing left for them to deal with. Number 13. You turned to become what they dreaded most: inaccessible. For a while, you played along without even recognizing that control was their game. They flourished because they knew they could access your time, energy, and feelings. They felt strong as long as you were still interacting, regardless of how nicely they treated you. They took you for granted because they thought your compassion, patience, and love were signs of weakness and dependency, respectively. But the day you just vanished was something they didn't anticipate. No cautions, no grand exit, no parting remarks to help them comprehend. You just stopped being present, focused, and energetic. At that point, panic struck. Because all of a sudden, you, the one thing that gave them a sense of importance, were gone. They were afraid of losing control over you, not of losing you. They understood they were still important in your view as long as they could elicit a response. However, they couldn't stand quiet or indifference because it made them face a reality they had always evaded. Their power only existed because you granted it to them. You are now inaccessible not just physically, but also psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually. Guilt, manipulation, and the poisonous push and pull they use to keep you bound are no longer ways for them to touch you. You're no longer looking for them, wondering whether they're missing you or longing for the closure they use to deny you. The fact that you don't care that you're gone, rather than the fact that you're gone, is what really disturbs them. For the first time, they are outside, seeing the life you are creating without them, the tranquility they failed to provide, and the self-worth they attempted to erase. Furthermore, they are unable to change it. They never imagined you would become untouchable, but you did. And that's the greatest nightmare for someone who used to rely on your energy to boost their ego. Number 14. You left the version of yourself that put up with them, not simply them. Initially, leaving seemed to be about them, their behavior, how they treated you, and their failure to provide you with what you were entitled to. Then it dawned on you that the true change was about you, not about them. Because you left the version of yourself that had ever accepted them, not simply the person you were with. Because you so much wanted to believe in their promise, you remained too long, made excuses, and disregarded the warning signs. The you who accepted inconsistency, confused poison with desire, and believed that love meant suffering forever. The you who believed that they will eventually recognize your value if you only provided a little more and put up with a little more. You really left that person behind. And for that reason, there is no turning back. Because by rejecting them, you're also rejecting the old habits, the old scars, and the old way of thinking that kept you caught in emotional fatigue cycles. You're denying that self-abandonment should ever be a prerequisite for love. They may have believed that you would always be there, that you would be patient, and that they could continue to entice you with just enough love to keep you interested. However, they were unprepared for the moment you decided that you would never put up with them again. Not out of resentment or spite, but rather out of development, and the unavoidable realization that once you rise beyond yourself, you can never fall back into your former self. And the fact that they could never have you back since the person who previously desired them is no longer there, is what really disturbs them. That's the true conclusion, not only for the relationship, but also for the version of you that thought they were worth the struggle. The process of growth is one way. You can't unsee the reality once you realize how valuable you are. You left a version of yourself that had previously accepted less than what you deserved, not simply a person. You ceased pursuing, demonstrating, and negotiating your worth with those who viewed you just as a convenience, a choice, or a source of approval. And now look at you, inaccessible, unconcerned, and no longer available for the games, the minimal amount of work, or the emotional ups and downs that used to exhaust you. They expected you to struggle, plead, and look for answers that they never provided. Instead, You granted yourself the one thing they were never able to: tranquility. They will never acknowledge how much your absence hurts them because of this. Not simply because you're no longer there, but because you departed with all of your strength, dignity, and self-respect still intact. And they know in their hearts that there is no way out of it. You've outgrown them in every way, not because you needed to prove yourself or seek retribution, but rather because you changed into a person they can't reach. And that's the true triumph. You already know you're changing if this message resonated deeply with you and you experienced a change in your soul. There's no turning back once you level up. And this is only the start. Please click the subscribe button, like the video, leave a comment below, and share this with someone who needs to hear it if you're looking for more honest, unapologetic truth that pushes you to develop, realize your value, and never settle again. Because we awaken more the higher we go. You won't want to miss what comes next, I promise.